Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I am joined by Shawn Bushway. Shawn has a PhD in economics and public policy from the Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon University, which recognized him as a distinguished alumnus. He has spent most of his career in the field of criminology, where he has been recognized as a distinguished scholar for the Division of Corrections and Sentencing and a fellow of the American Society of Criminology. He's published 2 books and over 100 peer-reviewed articles and journals, and he is currently a professor of public administration and criminal justice at the University of Albany, SUNY. I had seen a LinkedIn post a couple of years ago by somebody who had spent time in jail or in prison. We talk about the distinction between jail and prison a little bit in this conversation, but had spent time in prison for a drug felony and had come out and had a very successful marketing career. And I had reached out to that person, and we had talked about doing an episode on helping people with criminal backgrounds get into the workforce. It fell apart for various reasons. None were that person's fault. They actually had some great stuff going on in their life and didn't have the time to record a podcast. But a couple of years later, I was like, man, that was still a missed opportunity. And in doing some research, I came across Shawn Bushway, who I'm glad that I stumbled on him, but he really is one of the preeminent figures when it comes to research and policy around criminology and how to evaluate the risk of certain individuals and populations when it comes to their likelihood to commit crimes again, and therefore their hireability. And just in this conversation and the prep call, I mean, it totally opened my eyes, totally changed my perspective. I probably leaned a little more liberal on this topic, but definitely a lot of the statistics and things that I would have thought mattered really don't. And there's really only a couple things that do. And so I'm excited to share this with you. I know that's a long introduction, but I think this will be helpful. I hope you enjoy it. Here is Shawn Bushway. Shawn, welcome to the show. I appreciate you making the time. I had reached out to you the other day because a few years ago, I had talked to somebody about doing an episode on criminology and how to better utilize people with criminal backgrounds in the workforce today. And all of my searches led me to you, and I enjoyed our first conversation and so excited to dive into that today. So welcome.
Yeah, it was funny that you say that. I've been the leading expert on this area for a while, but back in 2003 or 4, I was one of 2 people that did research on that topic. It sounded great, provided people didn't understand that there weren't that many other people doing work on that space. But
It's more impressive now.
There are more people now, but I did my dissertation on the topic back in 1996, believe it or not.
So that's my first question is, what's the origin story for how you got into this work? What drew you to it? What's kept you in it?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. You asked, and I said, some people have great origin stories. Their father was a bank robber, but mine is that I grew up in the suburbs of Buffalo in a sort of exurb community. And when I was in high school, I went to a boys' Catholic school in downtown Buffalo, so 23 miles from my house. And this was during the mid-'80s. So Buffalo was declining because of the industrial collapse, and there was quite a bit of crime. And as a kid from the suburbs, this was just fascinating and interesting and scary to me. I rode the metro buses back and forth, hour and a half every day, one way. And I remember seeing my first purse snatching when I was 14, and just finding the whole sort of economic disadvantage and the residential segregation of African Americans and all of those dynamics really fascinating. And as I got older and started to get a better sense of what my skills were, I think at one point I thought I was going to be Mother Teresa. So I spent the summer working at a day camp in Lackawanna, which is pretty much all African American. I was the only white person in a camp with 75 counselors and 250 campers. And that probably wasn't my strength. Then I spent the next summer as an actuary. And the person at the end of that said, maybe you should work with people more. So trying to find a way to get into thinking about these questions and at the same time use it in an analytical sense, which is really my strength. And this connection between jobs and crime was always forefront of my mind because of, I think, growing up outside of Buffalo, where both of those things were salient. And over time, initially it was all about what happens when you lose jobs. Do you have an increase in crime? But then the other side of it is what happens if you've got crime and you have a criminal history record? Does that affect employment? And my research as a graduate student was among the first to show that getting arrested did in fact lead to problems in the labor market. Now that's more well established now, but thinking about these, it's not just one direction, that there's a causal connection between employment and crime, but there's also a causal connection between crime and employment. And so trying to get at that, and that's fascinated me for the last 30 years.
Yeah, there's a lot there, I'm sure. So just curious, like you started out, you talk about the sentiment in the 80s and some of the things that were happening there. I was born in the early 80s and so grew up through the 90s and early 2000s. And like a lot of social sentiments that were taboo in the 90s and 80s, we've come a long way and made a ton of progress on them in many ways as a culture in the US. How has our culture or like cultural beliefs around crime and criminals changed in that time?
That's interesting. That's an interesting lesson because I think the reality is the environment and the crime has changed far more than our perceptions of said crime. In other words, most people are not aware that crime rates have dropped dramatically since the peak periods at the mid to late 90s, and that the offending rate among young people is now something like 80% lower than it used to be.
Wow.
And historically, and the drops are really big. And historically, if you want to say 2 years ago, who was arrested the most, right? Usually the answer to that question is 18 to 20-year-olds. You know what the answer to that question was 2 years ago? 34-year-olds. In other words, the population of people that are now coming into the peak period of crime are offending at rates we haven't seen in 50 years. And such that they actually have lower arrest rates than 34-year-olds do, which is insane.
Wow.
So I think part of it is if you ask people, they will say that crime, especially there was a bubble during COVID, violent rates went up and in some cities it went up a lot, but they'll talk about crime as if it's the same as it was, and it just isn't. And neither is incarceration. So we know everybody is familiar with the term mass incarceration, right? But incarceration rates have dropped almost 30%. The racial disparity in incarceration rates have also dropped about 50%. There's just been really massive changes in both crime and the criminal justice system, and people are largely not aware of it.
Yeah. But what I heard you say is crime has changed, but our sentiment towards people who have committed crimes has not changed very much.
Yes, I think we're still stuck. There's two parts to this. One is the sense of how many criminals there are and what a criminal is and whatever. There's this other piece about when you offend, are you going to be an offender for life? And that I don't think has changed at all. I think our understanding of that has changed quite a bit recently, in particular, in terms of some of the research that's been done to show that the general statistics that people know are actually wrong. But I think, and I don't think that was well understood 10 years ago, but I think it is now. So I think in general, I think we're getting a better understanding of what it means to have a criminal history record and what does that mean for predicting offending in the future.
Yeah. Do you get much into in your research and work differing sentiments on criminals or people who've committed crimes in the US versus other countries? I would just be curious, what's the spectrum that's out there? We know our matrix that we're living in. There are other belief systems out there, I would have to think.
So what typically gets talked about is the fact that the European systems make less use of criminal history records in general because they're more private. Mm-hmm. So most European nations, it's not easily available to people to see what people's records are. So traditionally, the conversation is that Europeans don't use background checks, Americans do. Now, it turns out that's not exactly true. And in fact, there has been increasing pressure and use of criminal history records in Europe. It doesn't resemble America, but it is far more like America than it used to be. There is strong demand by employers to know something about the criminal history record of people they're hiring. And they're either putting pressure on the government to give them more access to the records that do exist or finding workarounds. to get access. But the traditional story of Europeans don't do background checks and Americans do is not nearly as true as it used to be.
Is that changing because European workers are committing crimes and the bosses are saying we need a better way to figure this out? Or is it more the sort of conservative sentiment that has grown across Europe over the last decade and the outlook of somebody who is more conservative, or a culture that is more conservative on crime and people who've committed crimes?
So I'm not an expert on Europe. My understanding is Europeans have a harder time firing people who subsequently do things on the job than Americans. And so there's less at-will employment. So there's more pressure on making sure the hire is right. Criminal history records do help predict future offending in certain ways. And so I think there's just a desire to use information that's available. I also think that European countries are facing historic levels of immigration. So what used to be a fairly contained labor pool is no longer. So if you think about what's happened with the EU over the last 20 years, there's a lot more movement between countries, a lot more movement into the EU from outside the EU, such that it's not just all self-contained. 30 years ago, if you were hiring in Denmark, you were probably hiring a native Danish person, and the information about that person was pretty localized, and that's no longer true. As the labor markets become more international, more cross-border, there's a desire to get information about behavior across those boundaries.
Yeah, that makes sense. That was just my own curiosity and the differences in how different cultures look at this. You said there, and I'm going to butcher this because I didn't get it exactly, but you said something to the effect of people are worried that people who commit crimes will commit crimes again. So recidivism risk there. And you said there is some there, but maybe not the way people think or exactly what people think. So I guess, what are the misconceptions and what is the reality around somebody who commits a crime and their likelihood to commit another crime?
Sure. So there's a couple things that you need to think about in this context. And the first is that probably far more people commit crime than you think in terms of getting convicted. So standard line is something like 50% of American men will be arrested by the time they're 50. I did a study that showed that about 30% of the men who were about 35 back in around 2018 in a national survey had been convicted as an adult. And among people looking for work in around 2018, it was almost 50% of the men had an adult conviction. Forget about what happened when they were young. So it's not uncommon, is the first thing.
Is there a difference there in like felony conviction versus?
Sure. About 8% of the American population has a felony conviction. And it's something maybe 30%, 25% have a conviction in general. I don't have the exact number for
misdemeanor.
Yeah, including misdemeanors and just including things as adults. So yeah, felonies are rarer. Felonies are crimes that could be punishable by time in prison, not jail. Jail is a local punishment that's only for less than 1 year, and prison are things either state or federal where you go usually for more than 1 year. So felonies are this crime that lots of people get probation, but you could go to prison at the state level for a felony. I think most people don't believe or understand that many people have arrest or conviction records. And I think that's partly because people don't go running around telling you that. If you get a group of 50-year-old men in the room, ask them.
Yeah.
And you might be surprised. And that's even if it's not a heterogeneous population among income or race or whatever. So the first thing is it's just not as commonly known. Someone who's in this business, I'm nonetheless always a little bit surprised when I find out someone has a record just from conversation or whatever. But at this point, I shouldn't be, because it is pretty common. So that's the first thing, is it's not as nearly as uncommon as you think. So if you say anybody that's been convicted of a crime is a criminal, then you think half of all American men are criminals. So you might want to revise that thought process. The second thing is that most people who get convicted do so when they're young adults. And so you have a fairly large pool of people who get convicted as a young adult, say would be under the age of 25, and then they stop, right? So most people, in fact, stop. And if you look at my statistics show that of the people who get their first conviction, about 70% will never get convicted again. Okay. The majority of the people will be convicted one time and that's it. And that should make sense, right? If you look at the rate of offending among young people, if that was still the same rate of offending when they're 35,
we'd be in chaos.
We'd be in chaos. So now that's not allowing for the fact that actually Generation X has much higher conviction rates than Generation Z. So these things do change over time. But in general, if you're just looking at one birth cohort, and I think when I say it that way to most people, they're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I'm not the same person I was when I was 20. Most men who haven't, even if those who haven't been arrested or convicted, will be able to identify at least one moment where they could have / should have been arrested.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
And then they'll say, I haven't done dumb stuff like that in a long time. And I haven't been arrested or could be convicted now. I haven't done anything. But when I was in my 20s, oh, yeah, I did that on a semi-regular basis. So, I mean, I think the reality is lots of people do things like this, but most of them do it when they're young and they stop. Now, that speaks to the question of whether it's useful or not. Well, think about this. Okay, we have a pool of 35-year-olds, and you're worried about who's going to offend. And you have two pools, those people that haven't offended or don't have a conviction record, and those that have. Which pool is more likely to have someone going to offend again? Guess what? It's not even close. It's the pool of people that have a conviction record. The problem is it's not one. So in fact, there's a bunch of people in that pool of people that have a conviction record who in fact have the same level of risk as the people in the pool with the non-conviction record. And some of the people in the non-conviction pool, because for various reasons, might actually have fairly high conviction risk. A couple of things is that non-conviction pool doesn't have zero. It's not zero. And so sometimes we talk about the risk of offending being zero for those without records. That's not true.
Yeah.
And then the next question is everybody in the pool of people with a record equally risky? And the answer to that is absolutely not. And so then the question becomes, can we differentiate between those people with a record and who are risky and those that are not? And the answer to that is yes. But prior to 2012, you were allowed to simply say, anyone with a record, you're out. And then the EOC changed the rules and said, wait a minute, that's not true. You do have to differentiate among those people with records. So there has been change in policy about that.
That's good. And so what then are the things that people should be looking out for when it comes to understanding what the real risks are of people who will commit another crime?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful probably to take a step back before we go into that conversation and talk a little bit about the current landscape for how employers do background checks. Is that okay?
Yeah, we were going to get there eventually, so might as well do it now.
Yeah, it might help because the answer to your question depends a little bit on who you are reviewing.
Who you're looking at and for what
who you're
role.
Looking at. Yeah. Not only that, just like literally, are you reviewing people that have already been hired, or are you looking at just a pool of people with records as opposed to the pool of people that have been hired and seen eligible by your company who then get a background check? The important thing to recognize is that the world of background checks has changed radically in the last 20 years. And even probably more radically over the last 30, because 30 years ago, most background checks were done through what we would call rap sheet repositories run by the government. So everyone knows what a rap sheet is, right? It's maintained by the state police or some similar organization. It's based on your fingerprint. If you get arrested, they'll take your fingerprint, run your rap sheet. And there was employer access to that at some level. But it's an arrest record, not a conviction record. And typically the dispositions there are not so great. That's what's used by the government to do top secret clearances and those kinds of things. Starting in the 90s, with the rise of the internet and movement of records online from sources like the courts, et cetera, there's been a creation of a whole industry of private background checks that are based on conviction records from the courts. So they're either scanned by their companies or they have access to the online version or they have runners at the courts or somehow, and they create vended databases of court records. And so that has developed and increased and expanded quite a bit. And that's a cheaper, quicker access point for records. And in fact, if you're looking for conviction records, it's probably more accurate than using the rap sheets. It's not equally accurate in every state, et cetera. There's lots of differences across states. And that expanded a lot. Now, there's some regulation around the use of those from something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I have my own research from around 2007 that basically showed that all of those rules were being ignored by consumer reporting agencies. It was like the Wild West.
Look at that.
And very smart plaintiffs' lawyers figured this out and started suing the heck out of companies and consumer reporting agencies that weren't following the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So most people now agree that people follow the Fair Credit Reporting Act pretty closely. So that's a major change because the Fair Credit Reporting Act has fairly strict standards about how and when you can use this information, okay, and the rights of the people with the records to correct incorrect information and those kinds of things. So you had a rise of online records and an increased enforcement of the rules around online records. But you've now reached a point where about 90% of large employers with human resource agencies will say they do some type of background check for criminal history records, which is not at all where it was 30 years ago. The second thing that's changed is that the EEOC revised its guidance in 2012 and said, you can't just say anyone with a record is out, and you have to use a variety of factors. The main factors that have been used prior to 2012 were what people call the green factors, which is type of crime, type of job, and time since last offense. And in 2012, in part based on my research, the EEOC says you have to differentiate and you can use more than just those three factors. You can also use the age of last conviction, the number of priors, and then other features of the person's life post-conviction. Okay. So they expanded the criminal history record elements that could be used and said you could do something called an individualized assessment where you took into account positive things that the person has done since conviction to counterweight the record, to look at this more holistically. The last thing that's happened is the ban the box fair chance hiring movement, which said that you can't look at the record on the application. And there's a variety of forms of this. But if you're a large company and there's 16 different laws across 17 different states, you tend to go towards the most strict version of the law. And the most strict version of the law says you have to make a contingent hire and then you can do the background check. So most big companies that go across the US follow a process that looks as follows. They make an offer contingent on, say, a drug test and a criminal background check. The person then authorizes the background check. They get the criminal history record. They do an initial screen, usually something called a matrix, where the consumer reporting agency maybe will even help them make a quick read. Most people will pass it. Those who pass that initial screen, even if they have a record, will get hired. Those who don't will move on to an individualized assessment, like an appeals process, where they can present more positive information. So that's the sort of the new process that's happening for most people. In some way, shape, or form. There's still lots of differences and idiosyncrasies as people learn how to adapt to the new methods. And what's changing now is people are starting to revise their frameworks to start to expand past this, the green factors, et cetera. So I can take a breath now if you'd like.
This is fascinating.
I can now answer your question.
Sure. I want to ask one question there first.
Sure.
Some of the things that you expanded on there, if they had some convictions, but they're doing positive things and they're active in their community, like you can factor in some of those things. Can you factor it in a more discriminatory way too? If they haven't been arrested again, but you're seeing things that are concerning behavior, can you factor that in? Or is that more just meant to help get more people into the workplace?
First of all, you're no longer allowed to use arrests unless you have independent information that the person was in fact arrested and they tell you that they committed the crime. So it's only convictions now. Prior to 2012, you were allowed to use arrests, but now you're not. And there's pretty good evidence that most employers do follow that and pay attention to convictions only. But yes, in some ways, you could argue, I've had this conversation with employers where they say, wait a minute. If they give me information that says they haven't been a good employee, so that there are things like, did you complete programs? Do you have stable employment? Do you have a letter of reference? Those kinds of things. And this is someone produces a bunch of stuff that shows they were lousy, that isn't very convincing. Can I use that against them? And the answer is, yeah. It's supposed to be a
Well, you'd be
holistic
able to use
assessment.
that against somebody who didn't have a conviction.
Yeah, but the problem is you're not collecting that information on them. So this will be a set of information that we'd only have on the people with records. But it's a separate decision-making process that has been triggered under ELC guidance for people with records.
Got
and
it.
so the FCRA law says that if you get to that stage, you have to have a potential adverse action letter presented to you telling you that there's a chance that you're going to lose the contingent offer. So you're at that point aware that if the appeal doesn't change, you're going to lose your job. Whereas in the first round, that is that triage stage, you don't even know that they found anything. It could be that O'Brien gets through, they find out you were convicted in 2022 of a bar fight. They decide that was a long time ago, and they let it go and don't even tell you they found it. Because this is usually being done in the back room by a centralized system. When advocates pushed for ban the box, they were hoping there'd be a more holistic assessment by the hiring manager. But from a legal perspective, no company wants to have to defend. If they have 50 hiring managers, that means they have 50 different hiring processes for background checks. And no company wants to do that. So the first thing every company does is they centralize it. So the hiring is made by someone who doesn't know anything about their record. And then the decision about the background check is often done by a group in the back room for everybody. And it doesn't interact with the hiring manager. And oftentimes the hiring manager has no idea what the record is or what the decision is, except were they allowed to finalize the offer or not.
All right. Now I'll let you answer my first question, which I think I'll have to reiterate in some fashion because I'm not exactly sure what I asked you the first time, but it was something.
Which factors should you look for recidivism?
Yeah.
Okay. So I apologize. I made you go backwards, but I think it helps. So
this is great.
For historically, the three factors that were authorized in the 1970s, not based on a lot of evidence, were the type of job the person was applying for, the type of crime they committed, and the number of years since their offense. That's typically called the green factors. And that's, in fact, what most companies' background check policies to this day still have, primarily. And then when the EOC revised its guidance, it brought in people like me. I was one of the people that testified, and they said, what other factors should we be looking at? Because there's a huge literature on recidivism. And they made the decision that we weren't going to be able to do the standard employment validity check where you say, how does this affect their employability? Like typically you'd have a skills test and you have to go through a validation to show that the skills test is correlated to performance on the job. You can't really do that if you're worried about risk of offending. And so the EOC's first decision was to say, we don't think you can look at employability in the same way. Therefore, you're allowed to use recidivism risk as a proxy for this risk of offending on the job, which is a big decision because now there's this huge literature on recidivism risk. And so they had people like me come and say, what does the literature say? And the two biggest factors in recidivism risk are age and the number of prior offenses. Shouldn't surprise you given the conversation we had before. A number of prior offenses should also not surprise you given that most people only have one. So what you end up with is a central fact in criminology, which is a small percentage of the people are responsible for most of the crime. The typical answer is if you look at a pool of people and look at all their arrests, 5% of the people are responsible for 50% of the arrests. So number of priors is capturing this idea that there's a few people that offend a lot. And so those are the two biggest factors. And what's particularly interesting about that is once you control for those two things, crime type doesn't matter much at all. Now, interesting fact about age. When I first went in front of the EOC, I had one of the most entertaining conversations you'd ever have in front of the EOC because one of the commissioners with great deal of indignation said, I can't believe you just came in front of the EOC and said we should discriminate on the basis of age. And my response was, I didn't tell you to do anything. You just asked me what the best predictors of risk are. And I said age.
Yeah.
Then there was a little kerfuffle. And then the other commissioner said, after a pause, Dr. Bushway, are you saying that we should discriminate against old people or young people? I said, young people. And he said, oh, we can do that.
Yeah. I was like, no, it's the other way.
It's the other way you're not allowed. So if you look at the EOC guidance, they say age and then the number of priors. But here's the interesting thing. If you control for age and number of priors, the type of crime is not very predictive at all of whether you're going to offend, even for that same crime type. And that's what
Wow.
always blows everybody's mind, because in this space, people have in their mind, I got to look at the job and then I got to find the type of crime that's related to that job. So if they drive, it's got to be driving. If they can have access to money, they're looking what they're, but the overwhelming consensus in the field of criminology, and this isn't just me, is that people do not specialize. And that's even if you just look at broad categories of crime like violence, property, drug use, they do not specialize. So if the scale goes from 1 is someone who specializes and only commits a certain type of crime, and 0 is a complete generalist, the average person is like a 0.17. So
Wow.
people just don't specialize. And knowing something about what they're going to do doesn't really help you know what they're going to do next, particularly once you've controlled for age and number of priors.
And is that true of that 5% of the population that goes to 50% of the arrests? Like,
Yep.
they're getting arrested for guns and for getting in a fight and for speeding and so like it's all over the place. It's just like guns or drugs, although there are those people, I'm sure.
Well, but think about the average drug dealer, right? If the average drug dealer or someone tries to steal that from them, they might pull out a gun and shoot. The person that's trying to steal burglary might get into a fight. And so all of a sudden now they're violent. So one of the things that's interesting about violence is that essentially, if you said every time you commit a crime, you have a 10% chance of committing a violent offense and a 90% chance of committing a property crime, which is roughly right. Who's going to commit violent crimes? The guys who offend more often, because they're just, if you have more bites of the apple, you're more likely to pull a violent crime out of the hat. And so there is a correspondence between more frequent offenders and those that have violent offenses. And the reason why we think otherwise is because of something called hindsight bias. Psychologists have shown this. This has actually been proven in liability and negligent hiring lawsuits. So you would suppose we get a situation, O'Brien, you and I hired someone and they ended up beating up one of our employees. And then we go back and look, oh crap, he had an assault 5 years ago. I should have known. Actually, you shouldn't have known in the following sense. There's a lot of people who commit assaults that never go on to commit another assault. Go back to my story, right? 30% of men have a conviction by the time they're 35, right? That's a lot of people that don't go on to commit the next thing. And that's called hindsight bias. And so we end up overestimating the probability that information tells us anything. Am I saying that employers shouldn't, couldn't, can't use a type of crime? No. What I'm saying is you can't do it on the basis of recidivism. It turns out negligent pairing lawsuits are based primarily on the green factors, which is type of crime, time since last, and type of job. And that's a real thing you have to take into consideration. Whether they should be or not is a different story, but that's just the fact. The negligent hiring lawsuits are driven by that. Now, most negligent hiring lawsuits are focused on 3 sort of types of crimes: serious violence, sex crimes, and driving. And for certain types of really serious crimes, you should be paying attention to this link, but that's only a small subset. And that's for brand awareness, and that's for things like negligent hiring. But if you're worried about recidivism risk, which is what the EEOC says you should be focused on, those things just don't matter at anywhere near the rate that everyone thinks they do. Now, the other part of this is you can think about type of job. And so typically the way people think about using type of job is linking the type of job to the type of crime. And I think you should use type of job, but only thinking about overall levels of risk that you're willing to tolerate. Some jobs are heavily supervised and have no contact with money and have no contact with people. You can have more risk there. We do risk tolerance in lots of other parts of employment and hiring, where we say we'd hire them for this, we want to hire them for that. And so I think that it's not so much that you should think about type of job with respect to the type of crimes, but rather for the level of risk you're willing to tolerate for the job based on the level of supervision, the level of exposure the person has to different opportunities. So you can still, type of crime is relevant there, but not in the way perhaps that people have thought in the past.
Interesting. I want to ask you a few, and you can just tell me like, no, I just told you this doesn't matter. But I just want to ask a couple. So men versus women, is there any difference there in recidivism?
So first of all, you're not allowed to, that's one that the EOC doesn't let you use.
That one.
You can't use that one,
All right.
but full stop. But it's an interesting question because men have obviously much higher rates of crime than do women. But if you look at women who have offending records, they look a lot like men. They have recidivate a little less often, and maybe a little crime types are somewhat different. But generally speaking, and this is broadly true, women who commit crimes look a lot like men who commit crimes, just that there's a lot fewer of them as a part of the population.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was curious is like, I get that it's smaller, but do they look the same? And it sounds like they do. What about white collar crime? Because that crime is committed by, I would guess, older adults.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I would imagine it would feel like there would be a higher risk to hiring somebody to a white collar job that has committed some kind of white collar crime.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, white collar crimes are not easy to study because they're relatively rare, at least the ones that get reported in statistics. So our ability to do a recidivism analysis on white collar crime is not very good.
Yeah.
So that's one of the first problems that comes up is I can do studies of thousands and hundreds of thousands of cases, and I still don't have huge numbers of cases on specialty crimes like white collar crimes or whatever. I think the issue comes down to, for a given job, the amount of damage that someone can do relative to other jobs. So in certain white collar professions, your ability to do damage is extraordinary. So it wouldn't be surprising that the background check process would be much more extensive and much more rigorous than in other jobs where your ability to do damage is less. So I think that's how I would think about it. The other thing is to recognize that there are, for financial company jobs, there are a lot of restrictions by the government, whether they're based on research or not, that says you can't hire someone to do a financial job at a bank who's had a financial crime. And so that's just in the books. There's nothing that anyone's going to do about it because that's the way it's written. And there are a lot of legal restrictions like that. And that creates a standard that says if you're the general counsel trying to approve certain types of jobs, you may say, based on concern about negligent hiring and my ability to get insurance for this job, et cetera, I may not take it independent of the question of recidivism risk, just because the harm the person could do is so much higher. Because you have to think about it. These decisions are not deterministic, right? If I say, I think O'Brien has a record and he might be more risky than I'm willing to tolerate, that may just mean that your probability of think is 5% instead of 2%. So I'm willing to tolerate 2%, 5% I'm not. If I don't hire you, there's a 95% chance you're going to be fine. Mm-hmm. And so when you make these decisions, you have to recognize you're making a lot of what we call false positives. We're denying people the right to have jobs who would have been perfectly good employees. After all, you already hired O'Brien. The only reason why he didn't get the job is because he has this record. And so you have to accept that you're going to make a lot of these mistakes. And the only way you can justify that is if the cost of not making that mistake, hiring someone who has a record, who then does damage to you, is high. And you can make an argument that's true, but you have to think hard about that because that's a lot of people who can't get jobs. I'm talking about ratios of 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 that you might be able to justify, but that's 1,000 people who didn't get a job, who would have been perfectly good employees in order to stop the one guy who really hurt you. That kind of trade-off isn't part of the normal thinking about this, but that's really what you have to accept because it's not that easy to identify the risky folks. And so what I generally advocate is thinking about in the triage stage, you're not trying to identify the risky folks. You're trying to identify the not so risky folks. And there's a lot of them. Right? Remember, 70% of the people who have one offense never offend again. So it's hard to identify the really risky folks, but it's pretty easy to identify the not so risky folks. Yeah. And so it's easier to change the discussion and make it about that.
Well, and to what you said earlier, you also have to realize that the pool without convictions is not risk-free.
Oh, absolutely.
And so when you're looking at the risk of somebody, when you're doing this evaluation, it can feel like because there's any risk there at all, that it's risky. But when you actually like factor in how much more risky it is than someone in the general pool, that number can shrink to zero. So How do people get a handle on that? Not everybody can call you. So do background check companies have this expertise? Like, where do employers go to think through these strategies so that they make sure that they are bringing on good people and can get good talent?
So this is the $1,000,000 question. And it's actually a sort of fundamental frustration that people have with the EOC, because the EOC said, you can't just not hire people. You have to differentiate. You can lose these factors. Have fun. Talk to a criminologist if you need to. And people are like, what? How am I supposed to do that? And it turns out background check companies are not allowed to give advice. That is an explicit part of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So they walk pretty close to the line sometimes, but they are not allowed to give advice because the decision is made by employers. And so it's gotten to the point now where there's a bunch of nonprofits and others that are running around trying to help people navigate this. And it's becoming more common because you're right. I have, in fact, created background check policies for companies that have been sued by the EOC, and then had the process approved by the EOC and said, yep, okay, Bushway said, so this is what we're going to go with. But not everybody can hire me. And so what I routinely get is, there some way you could just tell me what kind of basic approach you do? And so recently I have said, yeah, let me try that. And so what I've done is I've created something called the Bushway Opportunity Score. The best way to think about it is it's like a credit score for employers. The goal of a credit score is identify the good person that you can loan money to, right? You're not trying to identify the not good person. You're trying to identify the good person, the person that you want to loan money to. And a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. It's a positive thing. And it's based on positive behaviors, right? If you don't do anything at all, you don't have a credit score, right? It's all about positive things you do. And so the question is, could we do something similar in this context, particularly for that triage stage? Because boy, what typically has happened in the past is employers sit down, here are all my job types, here are all my crime types. These things matter, these things don't, based on a lawyer's opinion. That sounds bad, not based on science at all. And so could you do that more quickly? And so what I've done with employers is I've created a scale that is based on the things that you're allowed to look at. Number of priors, whether there's felonies or not, the age at last conviction, how long you've been an active offender, and how recent the crime has been. And just on the basis of that, you can identify a lot of people that are low risk, because the risk just drops dramatically the longer you stay free in society. So the first year out after your conviction or after prison, pretty high. But 4 years out, 5 years out, 6 years out, it's pretty low. And so I've been able to create a score that companies have been able to use to make that decision quickly. And I'm in the process of formalizing the basic rudimentary elements of that in something what I'm calling the Bushway Opportunity Score that could be available to employers or consumer reporting agencies to provide additional information to employers who are trying to make this decision.
So that is not available today.
You can go to my website if you want to look up Bushway Opportunity Score, and you can get some more information on it. It's in late stage formulation, but it'll be available within a couple of weeks of this conversation.
Okay, great. Then we will link to that in the show notes for people who are interested in that. And will that have a score for people with no criminal background?
No, this will be only for the people that make it. So the design of it is for people that get hired and then hit the background check, and you're trying to make the decision of, do I just let them work for us, or do I go to this next stage of an individualized assessment? So can I identify the low risk people and just not worry about them? And can I do that fast and quickly so that I can get them into the job as soon as I can? And then for the people that have more recent convictions or really serious convictions, then you're going to spend a little more time looking at them and trying to look at what kind of programs they might have completed. What kind of history do they have? Do they have a prior employer that's willing to vouch for them or whatever?
Yeah.
But you don't want to do that for lots of people, because that takes a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, sure.
And you don't have to. For a lot of people, they're just as, where the comparison is relative to the risk of the last non-offender person without a record that you're going to hire. In other words, you want to think about who you should make the offer to. You're going to hire somebody without a record if you don't hire this guy. And that guy is going to have some risk. The question is, what does that risk look like? If the guy's 22 years old, it's pretty high. right? Just think about it, right? Because he hasn't had time to accumulate a record. Oftentimes we seal the record the first time you commit a felony in the state of New York. First felony gets cleared, right? You get convicted, you serve your time, but it's off, right? You don't see it. The risk of those younger people in particular are quite high. And it's not the average employee without a record, right? It's the person you would have hired if you didn't hire this guy that you want to be thinking about, what economists call the marginal person.
Yeah.
And so I think what we've been doing is benchmarking these scales against the levels of risk that you would get from hiring someone without a record of certain types.
Yeah. And that's where I was going with it. Cause it's all right. That 22-year-old risk might be, I don't know, what's the scale based on?
Probability that you're going to
like 1 to 850, like a credit score would be.
We're afraid of confusing people by doing that. So we've been playing around with different levels. So I haven't quite figured out the top bar yet.
Okay. Well, let's say
because we use 8. Yeah. If it's 100, it's not 100, but I suppose it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's say it's 100. You get that 22-year-old, like they might be a 65, but a 22-year-old without a record might only be an 80. So I think that there'd be an interesting point there for people to be like, oh, okay, it's not that much riskier, or wow, this is a lot riskier.
So when the first research was being done on this back in the 2000s, the first question that people asked was, how long does it take before someone without a record looks like everybody else? And I was the person that answered that question first with my colleagues. And what we did was we took 2 people that were 20, and one of them committed an offense and the other one didn't. And then we followed them until they then had the same level of risk again for the 20-year-old without a record who didn't commit another crime. Okay. Now, the 20-year-olds who didn't commit a crime when they were 20, some of them committed when they were 21, some of them 22, some of them 23, 24, right? But there was a point about 5 or 6 years out where they looked the same. In other words, the risk for those people without a record who hadn't offended yet was the same as the 27-year-old with a record who had offended back when he was 20, but not again. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the same thing holds true for 40-year-olds and 30-year-olds and et cetera, that you can follow the path. The problem is people will just say, let's just use one standard, 10 years, right? Or 5 years. But that creates chaos. And let me explain why, that this is just a very bad idea. Because what you're saying is that the 40-year-old with no record who gets convicted for the first time at 40 has to wait 5 years. And the 20-year-old with a record has to wait 5 years. Who do you think has a higher level of risk when they're 25 or when they're 45? The 45-year-old or the 25? And in fact, interesting question, how long does it take before a 40-year-old with one conviction looks like every other 40-year-old without a conviction? How long do you have to wait?
I'm going to go 2 years.
Yeah, 1 year, because he is everybody else. If in fact he spent 40 years with 23 years without a conviction, this was a dumb, stupid thing. And so that 40-year-old, the day he's convicted, has a lower risk than a 25-year-old without a record.
Yeah.
And putting just having a standard that says 5 years, what you've then done is you created almost an infinite number of standards, and you're holding older people that were convicted to much higher standards than to younger people, which makes no sense. You'd like to have one standard. And the scale does that for you. It says, look, the probability, I'm willing to tolerate a 2% chance that someone's going to be convicted in a year, or a 1% chance, whatever it is. And everybody has to hit that standard. And once they hit that standard, they're good to go. And you consider not one feature at a time, which is what typically people do. They'll say number of years since or which crime you committed, but all of those characteristics in totality, just like you do in a credit score. They don't just look at how you did your car payment or whether you have a job. They look at all of those things and combine them into an omnibus measure of your potential to pay back a loan. Well, same thing here. Let's take everything and put it into one metric about the very thing that the EEOC says you should be thinking about, which is risk of conviction. And then create one standard, not 150.
Yeah. I like that. I can't wait till that comes out. I think that'll be very helpful for people.
Let's hope so. That's the plan. It's worked. Well, the good news is I know it works because I've used it for companies with whom I've consulted. The question is, there's a lot of issues around making this work in the marketplace, and we'll see how that goes since I'm an academic and not a business person like yourself. I'm hopeful that there'll be some smart people that will know how to take advantage of what I'm presenting, which is essentially a license to use my scale and implement it for this purposes.
Yeah. So I have one more question, which is, once these people get hired, are they materially the same as every other employee, or are there some differences to the positive, maybe positive or negative? But I'd be really curious, like, these people who have gone through a difficult time getting a job, do they have longer tenure, higher productivity? Does any of that come through, or is it just a wash? They're just like everybody else?
So the first thing to recognize is that something like 25% of the population of people that are working at any given moment have a record, right? So it's just a lot of people have records and have jobs and are working and are just fine. That's the first thing to recognize. The second part of this is when you do the screening, the reason why I made a big deal about the change in hiring process is that sometimes these gig worker, there's been some research that's showing that gig worker platforms, they don't actually do a, should we hire you first? They just do a background check. And when you do that, the people with the criminal history records do worse on the job than those without. And that's because there hasn't been a screen on any other characteristic.
Yeah.
It turns out that if you look at the people that are qualified for the job on some characteristic, right, then the criminal record doesn't matter quite so much. And there'll be people in that pool that will be just as good as anyone else. Yeah. Third thing, it is undeniable that employers can, in fact, screen and identify workers that will be just as good as their average employee and probably better than the marginal. In other words, researchers have done this with the military and with other employers where they've been able to get access to the data, and they find that the person who does make it through the background check and gets hired has the same record as the average person without a record. Now, again, I'm not sure that's the right comparison, right? It's really about who you're going to hire if you don't hire that guy. But nonetheless, it's absolutely clear that you can hire people with records and identify good workers. In terms of certain situations, it does appear, at least anecdotally, that people with records might be longer term in some situations simply because it's hard for them to get another job and the search process is harder for them. And so they're more likely to stay with the job rather than switch. And so there is some indication that they might be more willing to stay on a job that other people might not, simply because their alternatives are less. And they may be grateful for the job. And it's also probably easier to move up in a company than it is to move up to another company.
Although one of the process again.
So, well, I would say one thing that I never understand, but it happens a lot, is that there'll be companies that don't do a background check or have a very easy screen. Then the guy works for them for 3 years and then they go to promote them. They do a background check and then they fire them.
Oh, geez.
Not because they had a record in the last 3 years, but because of something they did 7 years ago. And every time someone tells me about a story like that, I just go, what, the 3 years that they showed up every day and were a good employee such that you're willing to promote them is more important than the thing that happened 8 years ago? Are you not familiar with the idea that people change? Have you not changed? And so from a positive credentialing perspective, what was it about all the stuff that person did that led to them getting a promotion that is more important than the thing they did 10 years ago? And I don't understand, because the probability that someone with a record, once they put down a year of good employment, their risk is like in the floor, right? And
they're off and going. Let it go. Let it go.
Let it go. So when they do that, and what people have said to me is, once I've seen it, I can't unsee it. Don't see it then, if that's really what you're going to see. Because remember, type of crime doesn't matter at the same level. Yeah, some people do some really horrendous things. Oh my God. And thank God they change, because they do. And you know they changed because they worked for you for 4 years and did a good job. So
there's two ways to look at that, right? Because there's no, I can't unsee it. And okay, you could look at that and be like, once a criminal, always a criminal, as we talked about in the beginning. Or you could look at that and be like, wow, good for this person. Like, good character on that person that they did that, made that mistake, and have now shown up here and been a good employee. And like, they've got all this grit because they went through hardship. There's another story there that I think you're missing.
The thing about it is, the once a criminal, always a criminal thing is based on Bureau of Justice statistics that said that when you look at a group of people that are exiting prison in a given year, almost 80% of them will get rearrested within 9 years. The group of people that get released from prison in a given year are not a representative sample of people that have been to prison.
Yeah.
Who's in prison in a given year? The guys who just keep going to prison, right? If I have a 10-year time span and someone's been to prison 5 times during that time span, and one other person went once and never came back, and I take 1 year out of that sample, who am I more likely to capture? The guy that was in and out 5 times or the guy that was in once? Obvious.
Yeah.
The guy that was in and out 5 times. So it's an oversample of those frequent offenders. So if you look at the people that are convicted in a given year and you say, how many of them are going to get reconvicted again? The answer is 70%, 70. If you say a different question in the last 10 years and take everybody that's been convicted, how many of them are convicted again in 10 years? The answer is 30%, 30. 30 is nowhere near once an offender, always an offender. And so using those Bureau of Justice statistics, which are used every day, all the time, is simply a mistake. They aren't capturing the group of people that are looking for work and trying to be employed. It's an oversample of the people, that small group of people that keep failing. And that's not who's looking for a job.
Yeah. I think that is a great place to wrap this up. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a ton from you on our initial call and here again. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this. And I think if we can change a few minds, we'll have done some good. So if there's anything else you want to say that you haven't said, feel free to share it. Otherwise, just really appreciate you coming on.
No, happy to talk to you. And it's always nice when people are interested in your work. I know that when you go to get a PhD, you're hoping someone besides your mom reads your stuff. And so it's always rewarding when someone like yourself, who actually does real things for a living, has an interest in the stuff that I've spent my life doing. So always willing and able to do it, because it makes me feel like maybe I didn't waste my life being a geek.
I'm glad to showcase you here, and to everybody listening, I hope this helps you think about other humans a little bit more positively and get some good workers into your positions at your companies and helps you be a little bit more successful. All the best out there.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.